She endured the taunts. She endured the threats. But when one of the 6 men on that train dared to touch her army cap, that's when hell began. For everyone. What no one knew that night was this: the attack wasn't the end. Captain Evelyn Cross sat by the window in coach car of Amtrak train number 376, traveling the Chicago-Denver route, watching the endless Midwest plains rush past in the cold November twilight. She was returning from a deployment in Omaha, where she'd spent 10 grueling days in meetings with military intelligence officers discussing strategic security issues along the Mexican border. Her Army uniform was perfectly pressed, her insignia gleaming, and on her lap rested a dark leather service bag containing classified documents that required personal delivery to the headquarters at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. Evelyn was a woman of modest height, but her gaze and bearing spoke of an iron will and many years of military service. She was 36 years old, and behind her were 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan, where she'd earned 3 commendations and a reputation as an officer who could not be broken. The train car was relatively quiet. Several passengers dozed on their seats, an elderly woman knitted in the corner, and 2 college students quietly discussed their upcoming exams. The train rocked steadily on the rails, and Evelyn had almost dozed off when 6 men entered the car. If you're interested in this story about justice and revenge, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support helps us create more compelling stories like this. They entered loudly, with crude laughter and the smell of cheap tobacco and alcohol that instantly filled the entire car. The ringleader, a man in his 40s with a broad face scarred and marked, with gold crowns on his front teeth, immediately noticed Evelyn. His name was Tyler Morrison, and everything about him, from his worn leather jacket to the insolent squint of his dark eyes, screamed that this man was used to taking what he wanted and disregarding the law. His accomplices settled around him, taking all the free seats in the section, and their gazes, full of poorly concealed interest and malicious mockery, fixed on the lone woman in military uniform. One of them, a skinny guy with a missing front tooth, snickered and nudged his neighbor with an elbow, nodding toward Evelyn. She felt the tension in the air. Instinct, honed by years of service in combat zones, told her that something unpleasant was about to happen. Evelyn straightened in her seat. Her hand instinctively moved to the strap of her bag, and she met Morrison's gaze with the cold, assessing look of an officer who had faced danger many times before. Tyler started by calling her a pretty little soldier girl and asking if she was lonely, offering to keep company with real men. His voice was rough with mocking notes, and the other 5 guffawed, clearly enjoying the moment. Evelyn didn't respond, just turned to the window, hoping that if she ignored these people, they would leave her alone. But Morrison wasn't the type to back down. He moved closer, and his hand reached for her bag lying on her lap. "What do we have here? Military secrets? Maybe you'll show us?" he said with a smirk, and his fingers touched the leather strap of the bag. Evelyn sharply pushed his hand away. Her voice sounded firm and commanding. "Remove your hands immediately." But this gesture of defiance only angered Morrison and his gang. Instead of backing off, he nodded to his accomplices, and they instantly surrounded Evelyn from all sides. One grabbed her shoulder, another tried to snatch the bag, a third started pulling at the insignia on her uniform, mockingly asking what kind of important bird she was. Evelyn was no helpless victim. Years of Army training and hand-to-hand combat hadn't been for nothing. She abruptly rose from her seat, struck with her elbow into the jaw of the one holding her shoulder, and he staggered back with a bloody lip. Then she turned and kicked the second one in the knee, and he howled in pain. But there were 6 of them, and they acted in coordination like a pack of wolves. Morrison grabbed her by the hair and yanked her back, causing her to lose balance. The others piled on her, pressing her against the wall of the car. Evelyn screamed, tried to break free, scratched and bit, but the forces were unequal. She tried to call for help from the other passengers. Her voice sounded desperate and angry. "Are you all cowards? Help me!" But the elderly woman turned away and covered her face with a handkerchief. The students hurriedly left for the next car, and a middle-aged man who could have intervened merely lowered his eyes and pretended to sleep. No one wanted to deal with a gang of armed and aggressive men. Evelyn realized she was alone. Then she tried a different tactic. Gathering all her rage and contempt, she began to humiliate them with words, trying to wound their pride and maybe force them to back down. "You pathetic cowards," she shouted, looking Morrison straight in the eyes. "6 against 1 woman. You're not men, you're scum, cockroaches. Even your mothers are ashamed of sons like you." Her words were like a whip, full of venom and hatred. She called them traitors, scumbags, said they weren't worthy of breathing the same air as normal people. For a moment, Morrison actually froze. His face darkened with anger, and dangerous malice flashed in his eyes. But instead of stopping, it only spurred him on. He struck Evelyn with the back of his hand across the face, and she tasted the metallic flavor of blood in her mouth. "Shut up, soldier girl," he snarled. Then he nodded to his men, and they began tearing off her insignia, ripping the fabric of her uniform, throwing her cap on the floor and trampling it with dirty boots. The worst part wasn't the physical harm, though bruises were already appearing on her arms and face. The worst part was the humiliation, the helplessness she felt as these people mocked the symbols of her honor and service. Morrison grabbed her service bag, dumped the contents right onto the floor. Documents, personal items, IDs, photographs, everything flew down. He took several documents marked classified, smirked, and stuffed them into his jacket. "These'll come in handy," he said with a grin. The rest, he and his accomplices kicked around the entire car, and they threw the empty bag into the vestibule. Evelyn tried to collect the documents, crawling on her knees on the dirty floor, but Morrison roughly pushed her with his foot. "Crawl, Captain, it suits you," he threw out mockingly. The other 5 laughed, making obscene gestures and cracking dirty jokes. When the train began to slow down, approaching Grand Junction Station, Morrison leaned down to Evelyn, grabbed her by the chin, and said quietly but threateningly, "If you squeak to anyone, we'll find you and finish you. Remember that, girl." When the train stopped at the Grand Junction platform, the gang calmly exited the car, whistling and joking with each other, as if nothing had happened. Evelyn remained sitting on the floor of the car with a swollen lip, torn uniform, and documents scattered around her. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. She collected everything she could find, put it back in the torn bag, and slowly got to her feet. The other passengers avoided looking at her, and this silent betrayal hurt almost as much as the blows. Evelyn stepped onto the platform. The cold November wind burned her face, and she wiped blood from her split lip with the back of her hand. In her eyes burned a fire that wasn't about to go out. She memorized every face, every voice, every detail of those 6 men. And in that moment, standing on the windswept platform of a small-town station, Captain Evelyn Cross swore to herself that these people would pay for every second of the humiliation they'd inflicted on her. She took out her phone from her pocket, dialed a familiar number, and when someone answered on the other end, said only one phrase, "Royce, I need your help. Urgently." The hunt had begun. Evelyn Cross spent the first 2 hours after arriving at Grand Junction Station in a small service room at the depot, where she was led by a sympathetic station manager, an elderly man named Marcus Stevenson. He saw her condition, the torn uniform, swollen face, trembling hands, and without asking unnecessary questions, offered hot coffee and a chance to clean herself up. Evelyn sat on a hard wooden chair in front of a cracked mirror and looked at her reflection. A bruise under her right eye was already darkening, her lip was split, and red marks from rough fingers were visible on her neck. But worst of all was the look in her eyes. They didn't reflect pain or fear, but a cold, consuming rage that burned everything from within. She carefully washed the wounds with cold water, combed her hair, and tried to make her uniform somewhat presentable, though the insignia were hopelessly damaged and a long torn hole gaped on her sleeve. Then she returned to her bag and methodically went through the documents, checking what exactly Morrison had stolen. 3 files with classified information were missing, and this complicated the situation. Now this wasn't just a personal offense, it was a crime against national security. But at that moment, Evelyn was interested not so much in recovering the documents as in revenge on those who dared to humiliate her. She took out her phone and called Major Royce Lightwood, her longtime comrade and one of the few people she trusted unconditionally. Royce served in the same military intelligence unit as Evelyn, but in a different division, dealing with counterterrorism operations across the western states. They had met 8 years ago during a joint operation in Kandahar, where Royce had pulled her out from under fire, risking his own life, and she later saved him from captivity by organizing a daring rescue operation. Since then, there existed between them that special bond that arises only between people who have gone through fire and blood together. Royce was a large man in his early 40s, with graying temples and penetrating gray eyes. When he heard Evelyn's voice, he immediately understood that something serious had happened. She wasn't the type to ask for help over trifles. Evelyn briefly and without excess emotion described the situation. The attack on the train, 6 assailants, stolen documents, complete inaction by passengers and conductors. She didn't describe her feelings or complain about injustice. She simply stated the facts, as military personnel do in battlefield reports. Royce listened silently, and when she finished, he said only one phrase: "I'll be there in 3 hours. Wait at the station." Then he added, "I'm bringing Zoe, too. We'll need her help." Zoe Hartman was a first lieutenant serving in the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID, specializing in analyzing criminal connections in the region and working with informants in the criminal world. She was 31 years old, and beneath her fragile appearance, blonde hair pulled back in a strict bun and delicate facial features, lay a sharp, analytical mind and absolute ruthlessness when it came to protecting the interests of the service. Zoe and Evelyn had worked together on several cases involving weapons smuggling through the Mexican border, and Evelyn knew that if anyone could quickly identify the attackers with minimal information, it was Zoe. She had access to databases that ordinary officers couldn't reach, and had connections in the police, FBI, and even among criminal elements who sometimes shared information in exchange for certain concessions. Evelyn sat on a bench in the station waiting room and began to wait. Time dragged painfully slowly. She tried to distract herself by scrolling through news on her phone, but her thoughts constantly returned to what happened on the train. She replayed in her mind every detail over and over. Morrison's face, his gold crowns, the scar over his left eye, the spider tattoo on one accomplice's neck, the voice of that skinny guy with the missing tooth who kept giggling. She memorized everything, every detail, because she knew this information would be needed. Exactly 2 hours and 50 minutes later, a dark blue Toyota Land Cruiser SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the station building. Royce sat behind the wheel, and Zoe was in the passenger seat. Evelyn went outside, and when Royce saw her face, his jaw clenched so tight that his temples throbbed. He got out of the car, approached her, and silently hugged her firmly, like a brother. Zoe also got out, gave Evelyn a professional medic's assessment of her injuries, and nodded. "Nothing fatal, but we'll need to treat the wounds properly. Get in the car." They sat in the cabin, and Royce turned the heater on full blast. The November Colorado cold penetrated to the bone. Evelyn took out a notebook from her pocket where she had written all the details she'd managed to remember about the attackers and placed it on the dashboard. Royce took the notebook, scanned the notes, and passed it to Zoe. She pulled a laptop from her bag, opened it, and began entering data into some specialized program. Her fingers flew across the keyboard at incredible speed, and within minutes, photos and dossiers began appearing on the screen. Zoe worked methodically and intently. She entered into the FBI database search system a description of the ringleader. Male, 40 years old, scar over left eye, gold crowns on front teeth, leather jacket, aggressive behavior. The system produced 12 possible matches across Colorado and neighboring states. Then she added details about the spider tattoo on one accomplice's neck, and the list narrowed to 5 people. A few more cross-references, checking dates and locations of previous crimes, and only one name remained on the screen: Tyler James Morrison, 42 years old, native of Grand Junction, Colorado, multiple convictions for robbery, extortion, inflicting grievous bodily harm, participation in an organized criminal group. The photo from the police database completely matched Evelyn's description. Zoe opened Morrison's case file and began reading aloud. He was the leader of a gang of 7 men who made their living robbing train passengers, extorting small business owners in Grand Junction and surrounding towns, and trafficking stolen property. The police knew about his activities, but each time cases fell apart. Witnesses refused to testify, victims suddenly withdrew their complaints, and the few pieces of evidence they managed to collect were insufficient for serious charges. Morrison was cunning, cruel, and had connections among both criminal authorities and corrupt police officers. According to law enforcement intelligence, his gang had recently expanded operations and begun operating along the entire rail line from Denver to Salt Lake City. Zoe continued digging through databases and soon identified the other 5 of Morrison's accomplices. Their names appeared on the screen one after another. Glenn Ryback, 34, specialized in lockpicking and theft. Frank Veracruz, 29, former boxer, handled the muscle work. Stephen Caraway, 37, driver and specialist in fencing stolen goods. Ian Lowell, 31, that skinny guy with the missing tooth who played the role of lookout. And Parker Sitwell, 40, had the spider tattoo on his neck, a former convict with 15 years of prison time. All 6 were connected to each other not only by criminal activity, but also by family ties and old prison acquaintances. This was a real organized group, operating smoothly and ruthlessly. Zoe also found their home addresses, contact information for relatives, information about where they usually spent time, what vehicles they used, what debts and connections they had. She printed all the information on a small portable printer she retrieved from the trunk and handed the folder to Evelyn. Evelyn leafed through the documents, and with each page, her face became more rigid and determined. She saw photos of these men, their criminal records, lists of their victims, witness testimonies that were later withdrawn under pressure and threats. She saw a system that allowed such people to remain free and continue their lawlessness, and she saw an opportunity to change that. Meanwhile, Royce pulled out a map of Colorado from the glove compartment and spread it on the hood of the car. He began marking points where Morrison's gang members lived or hid. Grand Junction, Montrose, Glenwood Springs, several small towns in the area. He calculated routes, travel times, approach and exit options. His military experience told him they needed to act quickly, decisively, and unexpectedly. Evelyn approached him, looked at the map, and said firmly, "I want each of them to pay, not just arrest. I want them to feel the same thing I felt: helplessness, fear, humiliation. I want them to lose everything they have." Royce looked up at her, and in his gaze there was neither condemnation nor doubt. He simply nodded and said, "Then we'll need more people. I have 5 guys from my unit I can trust. They won't ask unnecessary questions and will do what's needed." Zoe closed her laptop and added, "And I can provide information support and cover in case something goes wrong. But we need to understand, this will be outside the law. If we're exposed, we'll all lose our careers, our freedom, everything." Evelyn looked at both her comrades, these people who were ready to risk everything for her, and felt something warm stir inside: gratitude. But she didn't express it in words. Military people don't need long speeches. She simply placed her hand on Royce's shoulder and nodded to Zoe. "They'll answer for everything, Evie," Royce repeated, using her old nickname that only close people knew. "We'll find them." The next several hours they spent developing an operation plan. Royce contacted his men via secure phone: Captain Timothy Pritchard, First Lieutenant Slade Newton and Owen Turk, and Sergeants First Class Mike Zuber and Ivan Ratner. All 5 were former Special Forces operators who had been through Iraq and Afghanistan, men who knew how to act fast, quietly, and effectively. They didn't ask for details over the phone, just confirmed they'd be at the designated location in 8 hours. Meanwhile, Zoe began tracking the current location of Morrison's gang members through their cell phones. She had access to a geolocation system officially used only for counterterrorism operations, but in this case, no one was going to observe formalities. She established that Morrison and 3 of his accomplices were in Grand Junction at a private house on the outskirts of town, while Glenn Ryback was hiding in Montrose with his girlfriend, and Frank Veracruz was in Glenwood Springs at his parents' apartment. All of them felt safe, confident that their latest escapade would go unpunished like all the previous ones. But they didn't know that a hunt had already begun for them, organized not by ordinary police who could be intimidated or bought, but by professional military intelligence officers for whom this had become personal. Evelyn sat back in the car, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to relax for a moment. The pain in her face and body still reminded her of itself, but now it was mixed with anticipation. Soon, it would all begin. The operation began exactly 18 hours after the attack on the train, when all participants gathered in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Denver that Royce Lightwood used for conducting secret meetings and preparing for particularly delicate operations. The warehouse was located in an industrial zone, among rusting workshops of closed factories and weed-overgrown vacant lots, where even homeless people didn't like to appear. Inside, it smelled of dampness and machine oil. A dim bulb under the ceiling barely illuminated the space, and in the corner stood several army cots and boxes of equipment. Evelyn Cross stood at a makeshift table cobbled together from old boards, on which was spread a map of Colorado with marked points. Her face still bore traces of the beating. The bruise under her eye had acquired a dark purple hue. The split lip was covered with a crust of dried blood. But her gaze burned with such cold fire that even the experienced Special Forces operators gathered around the table involuntarily felt respect and slight awe for this short woman in a rumpled military uniform. Royce outlined the situation to everyone gathered as openly as possible, not embellishing and not hiding the fact that the upcoming actions would be outside the law. He explained that their task was not just to find and arrest the criminals, but to teach them a lesson they'd remember for life, to take everything they'd stolen and only then hand them over to police with irrefutable evidence of their guilt. Captain Timothy Pritchard, a man nearly 6'5" tall, with a shaved head and a scar across his entire cheek, was the first to nod in agreement. The other 4, Slade, Owen, Mike, and Ivan, also expressed readiness to act. For them, this wasn't just an operation. It was defending the honor of a fellow soldier. And in military culture, nothing is more sacred than comradeship. The first target chosen was Glenn Ryback, the lock-picking specialist from Morrison's gang, who was hiding in Montrose. Zoe Hartman had established, through tracking his cell phone, that Ryback spent most of his time in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a 5-story building in a residential area of the city, where his girlfriend Alicia lived, working as a cashier at a local store. Ryback had a bad habit. Every evening around 11 p.m., he went outside to smoke and drink a beer, sitting on a wooden bench under the building's windows. This was his weakness, his ritual, and this made him easy prey. A group of 4, Royce, Timothy, Slade, and Evelyn, left for Montrose after dark in 2 unmarked cars with no plates. The drive took 3 hours, and when they arrived, it was around 10 p.m. They parked in a neighboring courtyard with a good view of the target building's entrance and began to wait. Evelyn sat in the back seat, watching the lit windows of the apartment where Ryback was, and her hand involuntarily clenched into a fist. She remembered his face, remembered how he laughed when his buddies tore off her insignia, remembered his voice full of mocking joy. And now it was his turn to experience fear. At exactly 11:05 p.m., the building door opened and Glenn Ryback came outside. He was dressed in a tracksuit and worn jacket, holding a beer in his hand and a cigarette clenched in his teeth. He walked to the bench, sat down, opened the beer, and took a big gulp, exhaling contentedly. The courtyard was empty and dark. The only streetlight hadn't worked in a long time, and rare passers-by hurried home without paying attention to the lone smoker. Royce nodded to Timothy and Slade, and they silently exited the car, moving along the building wall like shadows. They wore dark civilian clothes, balaclavas on their faces, short rubber batons in their hands. Ryback didn't even have time to understand what was happening. Timothy approached from behind and with one sharp movement covered his mouth with his palm, muffling any attempts to scream, while Slade struck him with the baton in the kidneys. Ryback doubled over in pain. The beer can flew from his hand and rolled across the asphalt. They quickly lifted him under the arms and dragged him to the car that had already pulled up close. The whole thing took no more than 30 seconds, and none of the building's residents even noticed that a kidnapping had occurred in the courtyard. Ryback was shoved into the trunk, his hands tied with plastic zip ties and his mouth taped shut. The car quietly left the courtyard and headed toward the forest on the outskirts of Montrose. In an abandoned quarry where they brought Ryback, it was dark and cold. Wind whistled through bare trees, and the first November snow crunched underfoot. Ryback was pulled from the trunk and thrown on the ground. When the balaclava covering his eyes was ripped off, he saw 4 figures in masks standing around him. The headlights shone directly in his face, preventing him from making out the attackers' faces, but he could see their silhouettes, see how one of them, a large man with a baton, slowly approached him. Ryback tried to speak, but the tape on his mouth only allowed unintelligible moans. Then Evelyn approached closer, squatted in front of him, and ripped off the tape with one sharp movement. Ryback cried out in pain and immediately tried to speak. "Who are you? What do you want? I haven't done anything to anyone. You've got the wrong guy." His voice trembled with fear, and this gave Evelyn grim satisfaction. She leaned closer so he could make out her face in the headlights and asked quietly, "Do you recognize me, Glenn?" Ryback peered at her face, saw the bruise, the split lip, and recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by horror. You're that woman from the train," he wheezed. Evelyn smiled, but it was the smile of a predator that had cornered its prey. "Correct. And now you're going to pay for every second of what you did to me." What happened next was methodical and cruel. Timothy and Slade beat Ryback, delivering blows calculated to cause maximum pain, but not kill or cripple him to the point of disability. They hit his ribs, back, legs, avoiding the face and head. The marks should remain, but not so serious as to require hospitalization. Ryback screamed, begged them to stop, promised to return everything he'd stolen, swore he'd never touch another woman. But Evelyn stood nearby, watching coldly and detachedly, feeling neither pity nor remorse. She remembered her fear on that train, her helplessness, and now she saw the same fear in Ryback's eyes. When the beating ended, Royce asked, "Where's your money? Where's what you've stolen?" Ryback, barely able to speak from pain, gasped out an address: his girlfriend's apartment, in the closet in the bedroom, in a shoebox. Zoe, who had remained in town for coordination, received this information by phone, and 20 minutes later was already at that apartment. Alicia opened the door, and when she saw a woman in military uniform with an Army CID badge, she went pale and let her in without questions. Zoe found the box. In it was about $40,000 in cash, gold jewelry, stolen watches, and documents for a car clearly obtained illegally. She took everything, leaving Alicia only a receipt stating that the property was seized as part of operational activities. Returning to the car, she handed the box's contents to Evelyn. Evelyn counted the money, looked at the gold and watches. All of this had been stolen from victims like her, from people who couldn't or didn't dare to resist. She put everything back in the bag and said, "This money will go to the victims of his crimes. We'll find those he robbed and return what rightfully belongs to them." Ryback was tied even tighter, thrown back in the trunk, and brought right to the Montrose Police Department building. There they pulled him out, left him at the entrance, tied and beaten, and placed next to him a folder with documents. A complete dossier of his crimes, photos of stolen property, witness statements that Zoe had collected over the past hours through her channels. One of the officers called the police from a payphone, reported that a wanted criminal was lying at the entrance, and the cars disappeared into the night before patrol officers arrived. When police found Ryback, they couldn't believe their luck. There was so much incriminating evidence on him that a case could be opened immediately. Ryback, still trembling with fear and pain, didn't say a word to police about who had beaten and delivered him. He was afraid that if he talked, those people would return, and next time they wouldn't leave him alive. The next target was Frank Veracruz, the former boxer and most physically dangerous member of Morrison's gang. He was in Glenwood Springs at his elderly parents' apartment, who didn't even suspect what their son did for a living. Veracruz was more cautious than Ryback. He rarely left the apartment, communicated only with trusted people, and always carried a knife. But he had a weakness. Every morning at 6 a.m., he went jogging in the park by the Roaring Fork River, trying to maintain his form and hoping to one day return to professional sports. Royce and his group arrived in Glenwood Springs the next day and set up an ambush on the jogging path in the park. Early in the morning, when the sun hadn't even risen yet, Veracruz came out for a run in a tracksuit and sneakers. He ran along the snow-covered path, his breath coming out in white clouds of steam, and he didn't notice 3 people in masks emerge from the bushes. Timothy and Owen attacked him simultaneously. Veracruz was strong and tried to resist. He punched Owen in the jaw and tried to reach for the knife in his pocket, but Timothy knocked him down, twisted his arm, and handcuffed him. Veracruz was dragged into a car waiting nearby and taken to an abandoned workshop of an old aluminum plant on the outskirts of town. There, Evelyn was waiting for him. When Veracruz saw her, he tried to smirk, showing his contempt. But Evelyn simply nodded to Timothy, and he delivered a series of blows to Veracruz's stomach and ribs that made the former boxer double over, gasping for air. Evelyn squatted in front of him and said, "You like hitting the weak. Let's see how it feels when they hit you." And they beat him, long and methodically, until he began to cry and beg for mercy. Then they forced him to tell where he hid his money and valuables. Veracruz, broken by pain, gave up the address of a garage he rented on the other side of town. Zoe and Mike went there, broke the lock, and discovered a real warehouse of stolen goods: TVs, laptops, jewelry, bundles of money in various currencies. They took everything of value and left only garbage in the garage. The total amount was about $100,000. Veracruz, like Ryback, was delivered to the police building in Glenwood Springs with a complete dossier of his crimes. His mother later cried at the police station, not understanding how her son could have sunk so low. But Evelyn wasn't moved. She saw in Veracruz only the person who participated in her humiliation, and he deserved everything that happened to him. Over the next 5 days, Evelyn and her group methodically hunted down and captured the remaining 4 members of Morrison's gang. Stephen Carraway was grabbed in the parking lot of a shopping mall in Grand Junction when he was getting out of his car after a meeting with a buyer of stolen auto parts. Ian Lowell, that skinny, giggling guy, was taken right in his apartment at night when they kicked down the door and restrained him before he could even scream. Parker Sitwell, with the spider tattoo, was caught in a sauna where he was relaxing with prostitutes and a bottle of vodka. And finally, Tyler Morrison himself was taken last. He had been cautious and suspicious, but when he learned that all his men had been arrested, he panicked and tried to flee. They caught him at the Grand Junction bus station when he was trying to board a bus to Salt Lake City. Evelyn personally attended his capture, and when Morrison saw her, his face twisted with horror. She approached him, leaned down, and whispered, "Now do you know what fear means?" He was beaten harder than all the others. They took all the money he'd hidden at his mistress's house, over $200,000, and turned him over to police with evidence that guaranteed him at least 12 years in a maximum security prison. Within a week, the entire gang was destroyed, robbed, and arrested. Justice, it seemed, had prevailed. The trial of Tyler Morrison and his gang began 2 months after their arrest in the federal courthouse in Denver, a massive modern building downtown that had witnessed thousands of human dramas, tragedies, and moments of justice triumphant over decades. The case was assigned to Judge Barbara Irene Sampson, a 62-year-old woman with an impeccable reputation and steely character, who, in 35 years in the judicial system, had not issued a single verdict overturned by a higher court. The courtroom was filled to capacity. journalists from local outlets, relatives of victims, curious citizens, and several police officers who had spent years trying to put Morrison behind bars and had finally seen this moment come. Evelyn Cross sat in the third row, dressed in her dress army uniform, her ribbon bars gleaming on her chest, her face impassive and cold as a marble mask. Next to her sat Royce Lightwood and Zoe Hartman, also in uniform, demonstrating silent support for their fellow soldier. They hadn't come just as witnesses. They had come to see the finale of the case they'd begun with their own hands, risking careers and freedom for the sake of justice. The defendants were led into the courtroom under escort, and their appearance was pitiful. Tyler Morrison, who just 2 months ago had been an arrogant and self-confident gang leader, now looked like a broken man. His face was gaunt, dark circles under his eyes, and his gaze darted around the room with poorly concealed fear. He'd lost weight in jail. His once solid body had shrunk, and the gold crowns on his teeth that he'd once displayed with pride now seemed like a mockery of his current position. Next to him stood his accomplices, Glenn Ryback with bandaged ribs, Frank Veracruz, who could barely stand straight after the beatings, Stephen Carraway with bruises on his face, Ian Lowell, who had lost another tooth during detention, and Parker Sitwell, whose spider neck tattoo now seemed a pathetic decoration on a defeated man. All 6 were dressed in gray prison uniforms, their hands cuffed, and the escort guards kept them under strict control, not allowing them even to turn their heads toward the spectators. When Morrison accidentally glanced toward Evelyn, their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in his gaze flashed something between hatred and horror. He knew who was behind their capture, knew that this woman had destroyed his life and the lives of his men. But he also understood there was nothing he could do. Evelyn met his gaze calmly and coldly, not blinking or looking away, until Morrison lowered his head, acknowledging his defeat. The prosecution was represented by Senior U.S. Attorney Maxwell Jerome Dunn, a 50-year-old man with graying temples and a reputation as a ruthless professional who never lost cases when he had any evidence in hand. And in this case, there was more than enough evidence. Zoe Hartman, using her connections and Army CID resources, had collected such an amount of evidence that the defense had virtually no chance. The case materials included video recordings from surveillance cameras at train stations where Morrison and his men selected victims, testimony from 13 witnesses who had previously been afraid to speak, but now, seeing the gang arrested, found the courage to tell what they'd endured. Recordings of phone conversations discussing robbery plans, photos of stolen property found in the defendants' hideouts, fingerprint and DNA analyses linking them to crime scenes. But the most important evidence was the classified military intelligence documents stolen from Evelyn during the train attack. These documents were discovered during a search of Morrison's property, and their presence automatically transformed ordinary hooliganism into a crime against national security, which significantly increased the potential punishment. Prosecutor Dunn methodically read each charge, and with each point, the atmosphere in the courtroom became increasingly oppressive for the defendants. The defense attorneys, 3 court-appointed lawyers and 2 private attorneys hired by Morrison's and Veracruz's relatives, tried to build a defense on the grounds that their clients had been subjected to illegal violence by unidentified persons, that evidence had been obtained with violations, that witness testimony was unreliable due to pressure from law enforcement. Morrison's lead defender, attorney Leonard Ashford Chrysler, a man in his 50s with pompous manners and a habit of speaking in long, convoluted sentences, tried to convince the court that his client was a victim of a conspiracy by military structures that had exceeded their authority and organized vigilante justice. He demanded the exclusion from the case of all evidence related to searches of the defendants' residences, claiming they were conducted without court warrants. He tried to discredit witnesses, hinting that they had been intimidated or bribed. He even dared to suggest that Captain Cross might have provoked the incident on the train herself and that her testimony didn't deserve trust. But Prosecutor Dunn methodically demolished every defense argument, presenting documentary confirmations of the legality of all investigative actions, expert conclusions confirming the authenticity of evidence, and testimony from independent witnesses who couldn't possibly be connected to military structures. Judge Sampson listened carefully to both sides, making notes in her notebook, and her face remained impenetrable, not revealing which conclusion she was leaning toward. The trial lasted 8 days. Each day, Evelyn came to the courtroom and took her seat in the third row, silently observing how justice unfolded. She listened to witness testimony. An elderly woman Morrison had robbed on a train a year ago, taking her pension savings. A young entrepreneur from Aspen whom the gang had beaten and extorted money from for 6 months. A female college student they had tried to assault in a train car, but she managed to escape. Every story was horrific. Every victim carried trauma, and with each new testimony, the defendant's guilt became more obvious. Evelyn listened to all of this with a stone face, but inside her, a complex mixture of emotions boiled. Satisfaction that justice was finally catching up with these people, anger that they had remained unpunished for so long, and a strange feeling of emptiness that comes after a long-awaited goal is achieved. Royce tried to talk to her several times during breaks, but she waved him off, saying everything was fine. Only Zoe understood what was happening in Evelyn's soul. She'd seen that look in other people who had experienced trauma and thirsted for retribution. It was the look of someone who had gotten what they wanted, but hadn't found the peace they'd hoped for. On the 8th day, Judge Sampson announced that closing arguments were complete and the court was retiring to deliberate on a verdict. The courtroom froze in tense anticipation. 4 hours passed before the judge returned to the courtroom. Everyone stood when she entered, and the atmosphere was so tense it seemed the air could be cut with a knife. Judge Sampson sat in her seat, adjusted her glasses, and began reading the verdict in her clear, brooking no argument voice. She methodically listed all the crimes the defendants were accused of, and on each count declared them guilty. Aggravated robbery with violence, theft of classified government property, organized criminal enterprise, extortion, inflicting grievous bodily harm, making terroristic threats, possession of stolen property. The list was long and terrible. Relatives of the defendants sitting in the courtroom began to sob. Someone covered their face with their hands, and Vera Cruz's mother fainted and had to be carried from the courtroom. But the judge continued reading the verdict impassively, as if this were simply a routine procedure she'd performed hundreds of times. Then came the moment of sentencing. Judge Sampson paused, looked at the defendants over her glasses, and pronounced, "The court sentences Tyler James Morrison to 12 years imprisonment in a maximum security federal penitentiary with confiscation of all property." Morrison went pale. His legs buckled, and the guards barely caught him before he fell. Glenn Frederick Ryback to 8 years imprisonment in maximum security. Frank Maxwell Vera Cruz to 10 years imprisonment in maximum security. Stephen Arnold Caraway to 9 years imprisonment in maximum security. Ian Vincent Lowell to 8 years imprisonment in maximum security. Parker Samuel Sitwell to 11 years imprisonment in maximum security. Each sentence fell like a hammer blow, and with each name, new sobs and moans rang out in the courtroom. The defense attorneys tried to file a motion for sentence mitigation, but the judge coldly rejected it, pointing to the severity of the crimes committed and the absence of mitigating circumstances. The verdict was final and not subject to appeal regarding the qualification of crimes. When the judge finished and declared the session closed, the courtroom slowly began to empty. Guards led the convicted men down a corridor to the facility for transport to federal detention. Morrison walked hunched over, as if a huge weight had been placed on him. His lips moved soundlessly. Perhaps he was praying, or cursing, or simply trying to comprehend that the next 12 years of his life would pass behind bars. When the procession of convicts passed the row where Evelyn sat, Morrison again raised his eyes to her. This time there was neither hatred nor fear in his gaze, only emptiness and the resignation of a man who had been completely broken. Evelyn met his gaze and whispered so quietly that only those standing very close could hear, "Rot there now." These were her last words to the man who had humiliated her and thought he'd remain unpunished. Morrison heard these words, shuddered, and lowered his head while the guard roughly pushed him in the back, forcing him to move faster. Evelyn left the courthouse building onto the cold street where light snow fell from a gray sky, covering the city in a thin, white blanket. Royce and Zoe walked beside her silently, understanding that now wasn't the time for conversation. They reached the car, got inside, and sat for a while in silence, listening to the engine run and the cabin warm up. Finally, Royce turned to Evelyn and asked, "Do you feel that justice has prevailed?" Evelyn was silent for a long time, looking out the window at the falling snow, then slowly nodded. "Yes, they got what they deserved. Now they'll suffer, just like their victims suffered." Zoe placed her hand on Evelyn's shoulder and added, "This is the end, Evie. You can breathe now. It's all over." And Evelyn wanted to believe it, wanted to feel relief and closure. But somewhere deep inside remained a strange unease, a premonition that this wasn't yet the end of the story. It seemed that justice had been done, that enemies had been punished, that she could return to normal life. But life, as it turned out very soon, had prepared an entirely different turn for Evelyn Cross. Exactly 5 months passed from the moment of sentencing, and Evelyn Cross finally began returning to normal life. The bruises on her face had long since healed, leaving no visible traces. Her duties had fallen into a familiar routine, and it seemed that that nightmarish episode on the train was gradually receding into the past, turning into a painful but closed memory. She returned to work in military intelligence, participated in briefings, compiled analytical reports, trained at the range, and even began thinking about taking leave and going somewhere to rest. Maybe to the Pacific Northwest, away from the city bustle and reminders of recent events. Royce Lightwood and Zoe Hartman visited her from time to time. They dined together at small cafes in downtown Denver, reminisced about old operations, and made plans for the future. Life went on, and Evelyn almost believed that it really was all over and she could move forward. But fate had prepared a cruel blow for her that would shatter all illusions of peace one spring morning at the end of April. That day, Evelyn was in her office at the military intelligence headquarters on the outskirts of Denver, sorting through documents on a new case involving smuggling military components across the Canadian border, when Zoe burst into the office with a pale face and trembling hands. Evelyn had never seen her colleague in such a state. Zoe was always the embodiment of composure and control, but now she looked as if she'd seen a ghost. "Evie," she croaked, struggling to catch her breath after running up the stairs. "They escaped." Evelyn didn't immediately understand who she was talking about and looked questioningly at Zoe, who collapsed into a chair and continued. "Morrison, Ryback, Carraway, Lowell, Sitwell, all 5 of them. They escaped from the federal penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, 3 days ago." Zoe's words sounded like a hammer blow to the head, and Evelyn felt everything inside her go cold. She slowly set down the pen she'd been making notes with and asked in a quiet but firm voice, "How did this happen? How could 5 inmates escape from a maximum security federal prison?" Zoe pulled a tablet from her bag, opened a file with an official report from the Bureau of Prisons, and began reading. It turned out that at USP Florence 3 days ago, a mass riot of inmates had occurred, provoked by a conflict between 2 warring gangs. In the chaos, while guards were busy suppressing the unrest, Morrison and 4 of his accomplices, Veracruz had remained in the infirmary due to illness and couldn't participate in the escape, took advantage of the moment, broke through a hole in the fence using tools stolen from the workshop, and disappeared into the nearby Rocky Mountain foothills. By the time the guards discovered their absence, several hours had passed, and the fugitives' trail had gone cold. But that wasn't the worst part. Zoe continued, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "Evie, they didn't just escape. They clearly prepared for this in advance. They had connections on the outside who helped them plan the breakout. And now they've begun their revenge." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, though somewhere deep down she already knew the answer. Zoe turned the tablet so Evelyn could see the screen and showed her a photograph. It was a flyer that someone had posted all over Denver and several other Colorado cities, on utility poles, in building entryways, at bus stops. The flyer was printed with text in large black letters. "Captain Evelyn Cross, traitor to the nation. She trades military secrets. She takes bribes from foreign agents. We demand an investigation." Below the text were placed what appeared to be documents, scans of military papers marked classified, photos of bank accounts supposedly belonging to Evelyn, recordings of phone conversations with unknown persons. All of it looked convincing, professionally forged, and anyone who didn't know the true story could easily believe these accusations. Evelyn stared at the flyer, and her hands began to tremble with rage. "This is a forgery," she whispered. "All of this is lies. These documents, they stole them from me on that train, and now they've altered them." But Zoe shook her head. "I know it's a forgery. Royce knows too, but everyone else doesn't. These flyers are posted everywhere, Evie. Plus, they've uploaded all this online, on forums, social media, even sent it by email to several journalists and members of Congress. They've created an entire information campaign to destroy your reputation." Evelyn stood from her desk and walked to the window, looking down at the city spread below. She tried to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe that had crashed down on her. Morrison and his men hadn't just escaped. They had declared war on her, and this was a war of annihilation. They couldn't physically harm her while being on the run and wanted criminals, but they'd found a way to strike where it hurt most: her honor, reputation, everything she'd served in the Army for 20 years. Zoe approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out. We'll prove all of this is fake. Expert analysis will confirm the documents are forged." But Evelyn understood that truth isn't always as important as first impressions. The dirt had already been thrown at her name, and even if everything was later refuted, the residue would remain. People always remember accusations better than exonerations. Events began unfolding with horrifying speed. By lunchtime that same day, a request came to Military Intelligence Headquarters from the Army's Criminal Investigation Command, demanding all documents related to Captain Cross be provided for review. By evening, several news websites had published articles about a scandal brewing in Denver involving a possible leak of military secrets. Although Evelyn's name wasn't yet mentioned openly, the hints were more than transparent. The next day, the situation worsened. An anonymous source sent major regional newspapers entire dossiers with forged evidence against Evelyn, including photos of supposedly her meetings with unknown individuals in various cities, bank statements showing large sums of money transferred to her accounts, and even letters supposedly written by her discussing the sale of classified information. All of it was a grand fabrication, but done surprisingly professionally. Someone was clearly helping Morrison and his men. Someone who had access to technology, money, and knew how to organize an information attack. Evelyn understood that Morrison had connections in the criminal world, and now those connections were working at full capacity to destroy her. Over the next week, Evelyn began to feel the atmosphere around her change. Colleagues she'd worked with for years began avoiding her gaze. Conversations stopped when she entered a room, and at briefings, her opinions were no longer sought. The command called her in for a meeting where she was politely but firmly offered to take leave pending clarification of circumstances. Evelyn refused, stating she wasn't going to hide and was ready to prove her innocence. But she saw doubt and suspicion in the eyes of senior officers. Even those who had known her for years couldn't completely dismiss the thought, what if there's a grain of truth in it? The most painful moment was when Major Constantine Jacobs, with whom she'd served in Afghanistan and considered a friend, passed her in the hallway without greeting. She called out to him, but he merely mumbled something unintelligible and hurriedly left. Evelyn stood in the empty corridor, feeling a wave of rage and despair rising inside. Morrison was getting what he wanted. He was destroying her life from within, using the most dangerous weapon in the modern world: lies and information. Royce and Zoe remained on her side, but even they understood their capabilities were limited. Royce tried to use his connections to launch counter-propaganda and refute the accusations, but his efforts ran into a wall of bureaucracy and command's unwillingness to raise a fuss. Zoe conducted an analysis of the documents Morrison was distributing and proved they had been altered. The file metadata showed the documents had been edited after they were stolen from Evelyn and from computers registered in the Grand Junction area where Morrison's relatives and accomplices lived. But even this evidence couldn't instantly stop the wave of distrust that had already engulfed Evelyn. Moreover, new materials appeared online. Video recordings supposedly filmed by hidden camera showing a woman resembling Evelyn meeting with some man and handing him a folder of documents. The video was grainy, faces poorly distinguishable, but the resemblance was sufficient to sow additional doubts. Evelyn knew it wasn't her in the video. It was either an actress hired specifically or the video was edited using deepfake technology, which in recent years had become accessible even to criminal groups. But explaining this to ordinary people was difficult. They saw what they wanted to see, or what they were convinced to believe. 2 weeks after the information attack began, the situation reached a critical point. The Army's Criminal Investigation Command officially opened an investigation into Captain Cross on charges of disclosure of classified information and abuse of position. Evelyn was summoned for her first interrogation, conducted by Colonel Archibald Dawson, an investigator with the Army CID who had a reputation as a tough and uncompromising professional. The interrogation took place in a grim office with barred windows, and the atmosphere was oppressive and hostile. Dawson asked questions in a monotone and methodical manner, showing no emotion, but each question was like a knife thrust. Do you acknowledge the fact of transferring classified documents to unidentified persons? Where did you get the funds to purchase a condominium in Boulder worth $320,000? Why did you independently organize an operation against civilians without command authorization? How do you explain the presence of transfers from abroad in your bank account? Evelyn answered calmly and clearly, explaining that the condo was bought with a mortgage, that the transfers were from relatives living in Germany, that the operation against Morrison's gang was coordinated with Major Lightwood and conducted within the framework of fighting organized crime, that the documents were stolen from her and forged. But she saw skepticism and suspicion in Dawson's eyes. He didn't believe her, or didn't want to believe her. The interrogation lasted 4 hours, and when Evelyn finally left the CID building, she felt completely drained. The worst part was that Morrison and his men were still at large. Police and the FBI had organized a massive operation to capture them. Roadblocks were set up on all highways. All possible hideouts were checked. Relatives and acquaintances were questioned, but the fugitives seemed to have vanished into thin air. It later emerged they were being helped by a well-organized network of criminal authorities who provided them with safe houses, fake documents, and money. Morrison had transformed from an ordinary thug into a symbol of resistance against the system for certain circles, and his escape was perceived as a victory over law enforcement. And the information war against Evelyn was part of his revenge plan. If he couldn't kill her physically, he would kill her socially, transforming her from hero to outcast. And this plan was working with terrifying effectiveness. Captain Evelyn Cross, military intelligence officer with an impeccable service record and 3 commendations for valor, was now a suspect in treason, and each day brought her closer to complete collapse of the career and life she'd built over 2 decades. She understood this was only the beginning, and even harder trials awaited her ahead. The summons to the Army CID headquarters in Fort Carson came suddenly on a cold May morning when Evelyn was still trying to hold on to the remnants of her former life. The official letter, delivered by courier directly to her apartment, contained strict wording. Captain Cross, ED, is required to appear at the Criminal Investigation Command of U.S. Army Forces Command to provide testimony in case number 1847 FORCECOM as a suspect. Failure to appear will be considered evasion of investigation with appropriate enforcement measures applied. Evelyn read these lines over and over, trying to comprehend that she had been officially moved from the category of witness to the category of suspect. This meant the investigation had found sufficient grounds to consider the accusations against her not just slander, but worthy of serious examination. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter back into the envelope, but not from fear, from fury. Morrison had achieved his goal. His lies had penetrated so deep into the system that even the Army CID, which should have protected its officers, now saw her as a potential traitor. She called Royce Lightwood, and he arrived within half an hour. His face was grim and concerned. "They've gone too far," he said, reading the letter. "But we'll get through this. Just answer all questions honestly, and everything will be fine." Evelyn nodded, but both of them understood that truth doesn't always guarantee justice. The Army CID building at Fort Carson was a massive concrete structure, surrounded by a high fence with razor wire and guards at the checkpoint. Evelyn arrived there exactly at the appointed time, 9 a.m., dressed in her dress uniform with perfectly pressed creases and boots polished to a shine. She wanted to show she remained an officer despite all accusations, that her honor and dignity couldn't be taken away just like that. At the checkpoint, she was met by a young specialist who checked her documents with an impassive face and escorted her through a metal detector as if she were an ordinary civilian, not a serving officer. This was the first humiliation. Then she was led down a long corridor with walls painted a dull green and heavy metal doors behind which muted voices and the sounds of typing could be heard. The air in the building was stale, smelling of old paper, cigarette smoke, and something else, fear that permeated the walls of places where people's fates were decided. She was brought to office number 12 on the second floor, where behind a massive oak desk sat Colonel Archibald Dawson. Dawson was a man in his mid-50s with completely gray hair slicked back and hard facial features that seemed carved from granite. His brown eyes looked coldly and assessingly, without a shadow of sympathy or warmth. On his chest hung ribbon bars testifying to long service, but his face expressed nothing but professional detachment. He didn't stand when Evelyn entered, didn't greet her, just nodded to the chair opposite and said, "Sit down." Evelyn sat, keeping her back straight, hands folded on her knees, and looked Dawson in the eyes. She wasn't going to show weakness. Next to Dawson sat a Major Oliver Vickers, a JAG officer who was to keep the interrogation record, and another officer who introduced himself as Captain Brett Underwood from Army Counterintelligence. The presence of a counterintelligence representative meant the case was being treated as especially serious, related to possible treason. On the table lay a thick folder of documents, and Evelyn recognized in it those very forged materials that Morrison had been distributing around the city and online. Dawson opened the folder, pulled out several sheets, and placed them in front of him. Then he turned on a recorder on the table and said in an official tone, "Interrogation of Captain Cross, Evelyn Diane, in case of possible disclosure of classified information and abuse of position. Date, May 17th. Time, 9:05 a.m. Present, Investigator Colonel Dawson, AV, Recorder Major Vickers, OT, Army Counterintelligence Representative Captain Underwood, BS." The interrogation began with formal questions about biography, place of service, position. But within minutes, Dawson moved to the heart of the matter. He placed before Evelyn a photocopy of a document marked classified and asked coldly, "Do you acknowledge that this document was in your possession between January and March of this year?" Evelyn looked at the document and nodded. "Yes, this document was in my possession. It concerned plans for redeployment of military units as part of exercises on the southern border. I worked with it as part of my official duties." Dawson nodded and pulled out another sheet. It was the flyer Morrison had distributed, where this same document was posted, but with obvious traces of editing. "And do you also acknowledge this document?" he asked. Evelyn looked carefully at the flyer and shook her head. "This document is a forgery. The original was stolen from me 5 months ago during the attack on the train, about which I filed an official report. Then the criminals altered the document's content, adding false information and my supposed comments, which I never made." Dawson made a note in his notebook and continued. "We have an expert opinion confirming the document was edited. But the question is different. How did this document end up outside a military facility at all? Why were you transporting classified documents on a regular train rather than in special protected transport? This was an uncomfortable question, and Evelyn knew it would come up. She sighed and answered. I received a verbal order from my immediate superior, Lieutenant Colonel Kyle Eugene Tucker, to deliver the documents personally to Fort Carson within 24 hours. Special transport wasn't available at that moment. The next military flight was only in 3 days. I was permitted to use the train provided the documents remained under my personal control the entire time. I carried out this order. Dawson raised his eyes from the notebook and looked at her with obvious skepticism. A verbal order. You understand that transporting documents of this level of classification requires written authorization and special security measures? Why are there no written confirmations of this order? Evelyn felt a knot of irritation tighten inside. I was carrying out my commander's order. If procedures were violated, that's a question for him, not me. I acted in good faith. Dawson coldly smirked. Lieutenant Colonel Tucker denies he gave you such an order. Moreover, he claims you independently took the documents from the safe and transported them without his knowledge. This was a punch to the gut. Evelyn went pale and whispered, "That's a lie. Tucker himself ordered me to. I had every reason to trust his words." Dawson moved to the next block of questions, pulling new documents from the folder. "Tell me about your condominium in Boulder. According to our data, it was purchased for $320,000. Your official salary is $5,700 per month. Where did you get such funds?" Evelyn had anticipated this question and answered clearly. The condo was bought with a mortgage. The down payment of $70,000 was accumulated by me over 8 years of service. Plus, I sold an apartment I inherited from my grandmother in Grand Junction. All transaction documents are at the bank and can be provided. Dawson nodded, but his face remained impenetrable. "And how do you explain transfers to your account from abroad? Over the past year, your account received 4 transfers from Germany totaling $80,000. Evelyn clenched her fists under the table, trying to maintain composure. "Those transfers were from my aunt, Lydia Frances Cross, who has lived in Berlin for 20 years. She helped me financially because she has no children of her own and considers me her heir. I have all confirming letters and documents." Dawson made another note, but Evelyn saw he didn't believe her, or didn't want to believe. Then came the most painful question. Dawson pulled out a photograph, that very video recording where a woman resembling Evelyn meets with an unknown man and hands him a folder. "Explain what's happening in this video." Evelyn looked at the blurry image and shook her head. "That's not me. This is either a setup using an actress or a fabrication. I never met with this person and never handed anyone any documents outside official procedure." Dawson leaned forward, his voice becoming harder. "Facial analysis shows 78% match with your appearance. That's a fairly high indicator." Evelyn felt blood rush to her face with rage. 78% is not 100%. That means there's 22% discrepancy, which could well indicate another person or use of digital editing technologies. I demand a full independent analysis of this video using modern analytical methods. Dawson leaned back in his chair and said coldly, "Your demand will be considered. But for now, we have sufficient grounds to suspect you of violating military discipline and possible disclosure of classified information." The interrogation continued another 3.5 hours. Dawson methodically went through each point of accusations, asking questions about her relationships with colleagues, why she organized an independent operation against Morrison's gang without official command coordination, whether she was taking revenge on criminals for personal reasons, exceeding her authority. Each question was aimed at presenting her actions as unbecoming an officer, as violations of subordination and law. Evelyn answered all questions honestly, explaining the operation was coordinated with Major Lightwood, that all their actions were aimed at capturing dangerous criminals, that they had evidence of these people's guilt. But she saw Dawson wasn't listening to her explanations with an open mind. He had already formed an opinion about her, and that opinion was negative. For him, she was a problem officer who exceeded authority, acted independently, and was now trying to justify herself. When the interrogation finally ended, Evelyn felt completely exhausted, as if she'd gone through a multi-hour battle. Dawson turned off the recorder, closed the folder, and said in an official tone, "Captain Cross, you are prohibited from leaving Colorado State pending completion of the investigation. Your military ID is temporarily confiscated. You are suspended from duty pending a final decision. You may go." Evelyn left the Army CID building, and the world around her seemed changed. The sky was gray, light rain drizzled, and people on the streets hurried about their business, paying no attention to the woman in military uniform standing on the steps, trying to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe that had crashed down on her life. She was suspended from duty. Her name was disgraced. She was considered a potential traitor. Everything she'd lived and worked for 20 years had been destroyed in a few weeks. Royce was waiting for her by the car and, seeing her face, silently embraced her. They stood like that for several minutes in the rain, and Evelyn finally allowed herself to cry, not from weakness, but from rage and injustice. "I'll prove my innocence," she whispered through tears. "I'll prove all of this is lies, and they'll all pay for it." 2 weeks after the interrogation at Army CID became a real test of strength for Evelyn Cross. Despite official suspension from duty, she continued appearing at Fort Carson's Military Intelligence Battalion headquarters, where she'd been temporarily transferred from Denver, trying to maintain at least some semblance of normal life. She wasn't allowed near classified documents, wasn't invited to briefings, wasn't given any assignments, but she came every morning, sat in the empty office assigned to her, and pretended to be busy with work, though in reality she just went through old reports and tried not to think about how everything was collapsing around her. The atmosphere at the unit had changed drastically. Officers who used to greet her in the hallways now averted their eyes. Some demonstratively crossed to the other side to avoid meeting her. In the dining facility, no one kept her company at lunch anymore, and she sat alone at a corner table, feeling stares full of condemnation and suspicion. Whispers behind her back became a constant background of her existence. She heard snatches of conversations where her name was mentioned, words like traitor, bribes, treason. Even those who once called her comrade and friend now shunned her, afraid that closeness to a disgraced officer might harm their own careers. Royce Lightwood and Zoe Hartman remained the only ones who still believed in her innocence and maintained contact. But even they received official warnings from command that their contacts with Cross were viewed as undesirable and could affect their service standing. All of this pressed on Evelyn with incredible force, destroying her from within, slowly but inexorably. She was a military person, accustomed to clear structure, discipline, respect for rank and merit, and suddenly found herself in a situation where all of this was taken from her without trial or investigation, simply based on rumors and forged documents. She woke at night in cold sweats, nightmares where she relived that moment on the train over and over when Morrison and his men humiliated her, then saw herself in a courtroom where the judge read a verdict, not against Morrison, but against her. She began losing weight. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. Her hands trembled when she tried to hold a coffee cup. Royce saw how she was changing, how the inner fire that once burned in her was slowly fading, and this frightened him most of all. He tried talking to her, convincing her to take leave, go somewhere far from this nightmare, but Evelyn stubbornly refused. "If I leave, it'll look like an admission of guilt," she said. "I have to stay here and prove I'm innocent." But with each day her position grew weaker, and her enemies seemed to strengthen. The critical point came at the end of May, when a morning formation of the entire unit was held before the start of exercises. Formation was mandatory for all officers and soldiers, and Evelyn, despite her suspension, also attended, standing in formation in her perfectly pressed uniform, trying to maintain dignity and bearing. The weather was overcast. Low clouds covered the sky, and cold winds swept across the parade ground, making flags snap on their poles. The battalion commander, Colonel Gordon Raymond Sullivan, came to the reviewing stand and began the usual morning speech about upcoming exercises and the need to maintain high combat readiness. Evelyn listened half-heartedly, her thoughts occupied with something else entirely. She was thinking about how yesterday Zoe had informed her of a new wave of publications online, where Morrison and his accomplices continued throwing dirt at her, distributing new fake documents and testimonies. But suddenly her attention was caught by a voice that rang out from formation to her left. Lieutenant Isaac Sheldon, a young officer about 28 who'd been serving in the unit only 6 months and whom Evelyn knew only by sight, loudly said, addressing his neighbor but so everyone around could hear, "Don't understand why they let traitors stand in the same formation with honest officers." Sheldon's words sounded like a slap. The entire formation froze, and several dozen pairs of eyes turned toward Evelyn. She felt blood rush to her face, felt something inside snap. Sheldon continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "They say she was selling secrets, and nothing happens to her. That's how our service works. For our own, everything's forgiven." His voice was full of poisonous mockery and contempt. Evelyn stood clenching her fists so hard her nails dug into her palms until blood. She tried to restrain herself, tried not to react, but something inside her broke. All those humiliations, all the fear, all the injustice of recent weeks suddenly burst out in the form of uncontrollable anger. She abruptly stepped out of formation, walked several paces to Sheldon, who didn't even have time to understand what was happening, and punched him in the face with such force he flew back and fell to the ground, clutching his bloody nose. "Shut up," Evelyn snarled, standing over him, her voice trembling with rage. "You know nothing. You're a pathetic coward who dares to judge me." Sheldon tried to get up, his face twisted with pain and shock, and he shouted, "She hit me! You all saw it! She attacked me!" Several officers rushed toward them, trying to separate them, but Evelyn was already unstoppable. When Captain Vernon Cornwell tried to grab her arm, she shoved him away with such force he barely kept his balance. A real scuffle broke out. Major Anthony Bishop and First Lieutenant Ian Sutton tried to restrain Evelyn, but she resisted like a cornered animal, delivering blows with elbows and feet, trying to break free from their grip. Her screams carried across the entire parade ground. "Let me go! I won't let these liars trample my name. I'm not guilty!" The entire formation turned into chaos. Soldiers and officers crowded around, some trying to help restrain Evelyn, others just standing and watching in amazement and horror as a respected captain of military intelligence completely lost control. Finally, 4 officers managed to tackle her to the ground and bind her hands behind her back. Evelyn lay on the cold ground of the parade field, her uniform stained with dirt, hair disheveled, blood flowing from her split lip. She breathed heavily, her chest heaving, and her eyes burned with wild fire. Colonel Sullivan descended from the reviewing stand, his face red with anger. He approached the prone Evelyn and said coldly, "Captain Cross, you are under arrest for assaulting a fellow officer, insubordination, and violation of military discipline. Take her to the stockade immediately." Evelyn was lifted to her feet, handcuffed, and led across the entire parade ground to the stockade building located on the installation. This was a small brick barracks with barred windows where military personnel who committed disciplinary offenses were held. The entire unit watched this shameful procession. A captain of military intelligence who had once been a hero and role model now walked in handcuffs under escort like a common criminal. Evelyn walked with her head held high. Despite the dirt on her uniform and blood on her face, she wasn't going to show weakness. Her eyes met the eyes of several officers standing aside, and in their gazes she saw a mixture of pity, condemnation, and fear. Only Royce Lightwood, standing at the far end of formation, looked at her with pain and sympathy, and she knew he was the only one who understood what she was going through. She was led into a stockade cell, a small 10 by 13-foot room with bare concrete walls, an iron bunk covered with a thin mattress, and a single window near the ceiling through which meager daylight penetrated. The handcuffs were removed, the door slammed shut with a metallic clang, and the lock turned with a loud click. Evelyn was left alone in the cold cell. She slowly lowered herself onto the bunk, and only then did the full weight of what had happened sink in. She had struck a fellow officer at formation in front of the entire unit, openly violated discipline, and now sat in a stockade cell like a criminal. Her career was destroyed completely. Even if the Army CID investigation found no evidence of her guilt in disclosing secrets, this incident alone was sufficient for discharge from the armed forces with dishonor. She covered her face with her hands and felt tears rolling down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of anger. Anger at Morrison and his gang who had destroyed her life with their lies. Anger at the system that believed those lies and didn't give her a chance to defend herself. Anger at Sheldon and all those who judged her without knowing the truth. And anger at herself for allowing emotions to take over and making a fatal mistake. She sat like that for several hours while darkness began falling outside the window. A guard brought her meager dinner, a piece of black bread and a bowl of thin soup, but she didn't touch the food. Her thoughts were occupied with only one thing: how to get out of this pit, how to prove her innocence, and how to punish everyone who brought her to this state. The next day, Royce came to see her at the stockade. His face was serious and worried as he sat in a chair opposite the bars separating detainees from visitors. "Evie, what have you done?" he said quietly. "You gave them everything they wanted. Now they can point to this incident as proof you're unstable, that you're dangerous, that you can't control yourself." Evelyn looked at him through the bars, her voice hoarse. "I know. I ruined everything. But I couldn't take it anymore, Royce. I couldn't keep hearing myself called a traitor when I gave this army my entire life." Royce nodded with understanding. "I know, but now we need to think about how to get you out of here. The investigation into your case is moving forward. They have 30 days to decide what to do with you next, either drop the charges or refer the case to court-martial." Evelyn straightened on the bunk, and in her eyes appeared that same steely glint Royce knew so well. "Then I have 30 days to prove my innocence and find a way to take revenge on everyone who betrayed me. This isn't the end, Royce. This is only the beginning." The cold stockade cell became for Evelyn Cross the place where she spent the 30 most agonizing and simultaneously most important days of her life. The concrete walls, painted dull gray, seemed to press on her from all sides, and the single window near the ceiling let in so little light that even during the day, the cell was shrouded in twilight. An iron bunk with a sagging mattress, a small table bolted to the wall, and a bucket in the corner for bodily needs. That was the entire furnishing of her new temporary home. At night, the temperature dropped so low that Evelyn shivered under the thin blanket trying to warm up. And during the day, the stuffiness and stale air caused headaches and nausea. Food was meager. 3 times a day they brought watery gruel that could hardly be called food, a piece of stale bread, and a mug of cloudy tea. But physical discomforts were nothing compared to the psychological pressure. Solitude, silence broken only by guards' footsteps outside the door, and rare shouts from other detainees in neighboring cells. Absence of any news about the investigation's progress, all of this slowly sapped her strength. The first few days Evelyn spent in a state close to apathy, lying on the bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying in her mind all the events of recent months over and over, trying to understand where she'd made mistakes, what could have been done differently. But gradually, apathy began giving way to something else: cold, calculated determination. On the 3rd night in the cell, when outside the window an icy wind howled and seeped through cracks in the wall, Evelyn lay on the bunk, unable to sleep. Her thoughts were concentrated on one thing: the injustice of what was happening to her. She remembered every face, every person who had betrayed her. Tyler Morrison and his gang, who stole her documents and turned her life into a nightmare. Lieutenant Colonel Tucker, who denied giving her the order to transport documents, saving his own skin. Colonel Dawson from Army CID, who conducted the investigation with prejudice, already initially considering her guilty. Lieutenant Sheldon, who publicly called her a traitor. All those officers and soldiers who turned away from her, not giving her a chance to justify herself. Lieutenant Colonel Tucker had been demoted in rank and transferred to another unit, but she knew there were many like him in the system, people ready to lie and betray a comrade to save their own career. Investigator Dawson received a reprimand but continued working at Army CID, and Evelyn occasionally saw him in the corridors, and each encounter was like a knife thrust. Lieutenant Sheldon, who publicly called her a traitor, left the Army, but the damage he inflicted on her reputation remained. Each name, each face was etched into her memory like a brand with red-hot iron. And in that moment, lying in the cold darkness, Evelyn made herself an oath. She whispered it aloud, as if pronouncing a sacred prayer. This is injustice. This is monstrous, flagrant injustice, and I won't let it win. I'll prove my innocence. I'll find a way to clear my name, and I'll take revenge on everyone who participated in this conspiracy against me. Morrison will pay. All his accomplices will pay, and all those who betrayed me in the Army will also learn what it means to cross Evelyn Cross. This oath became her anchor, what kept her from falling into the abyss of despair. From that moment, every morning she woke with one thought: survive, prove the truth, and carry out retribution. Royce Lightwood visited her every 3 days, bringing packages with normal food, clean clothes, and most importantly, news about what was happening outside. It was from Royce that Evelyn learned the investigation into her case was progressing slowly, that Army CID was still collecting evidence and conducting analyses. Royce also reported that he and Zoe were working tirelessly, trying to find evidence that could refute the accusations against Evelyn. Zoe used all her connections in Army counterintelligence to gain access to originals of documents stolen by Morrison and conduct detailed metadata analysis of files the criminals were distributing online. The analysis showed the files were created on computers registered to an internet cafe network in Grand Junction, and during a period when Morrison was already arrested. This meant someone from his accomplices on the outside was working on forging documents. Moreover, Zoe managed to find a hacker named Austin Gregory Holden, who worked in Colorado Springs and specialized in digital forensics. Austin agreed to help, motivated not by money — Royce paid him a symbolic sum — but by interest in a complex technical challenge. He restored the complete edit history of the forged documents, showing they were altered using graphics editors, and that the originals bore Evelyn's digital signatures that were forged using stolen certificates. Royce brought Evelyn all these materials, printed and neatly filed in a folder. Evelyn read Austin's reports, and with each page, hope kindled in her chest. Here it was, proof of her innocence, irrefutable, technical, based on facts rather than rumors and suspicions. But Royce warned her that technical evidence alone might not be enough. Dawson is stubborn, he said. He's already invested a lot of effort in this case and doesn't want to admit he was wrong. We need more. We need to find who was helping Morrison from inside the system. Evelyn nodded, understanding Royce was right. Morrison couldn't have organized such a complex information attack alone while on the run. He must have had an accomplice, someone from law enforcement or military structures who had access to databases and could provide information about Evelyn's movements, her service status, the investigation's progress. And finding this person was critically important. Royce promised that he and Zoe would keep digging and wouldn't stop until they uncovered the whole truth. Besides working on evidence of innocence, Evelyn began methodically planning her revenge. She asked Royce to bring her a notebook and pen, and every evening, by the light of a dim bulb, she wrote down the names of everyone who had harmed her, compiled lists, drew connection diagrams between people, thought through possible ways of influencing each of them. Morrison and his gang stood first. They were the main culprits of her suffering, and she wanted them to receive punishment not just in the form of prison sentences, but something more. something that would make them suffer just as she had suffered. She remembered the words of one of her old commanders who said, "Revenge is a dish best served cold. Hot anger makes you commit mistakes, while cold calculation leads to victory." And Evelyn followed this principle. She didn't allow emotions to cloud her mind. She calculated every step, every action that needed to be taken after release. She also compiled a list of those who betrayed her in the Army, officers who turned away from her, commanders who didn't defend her, investigators who conducted the case with prejudice. And for each of them, she had a plan. On the 15th day of her detention, a lawyer came to see her. His name was Prescott Daniel Bellings, an elderly man in his mid-60s with a gray beard and penetrating blue eyes. Royce had found him through his connections. Bellings was a renowned attorney specializing in military cases and had a reputation as someone who never gave up and always saw cases through to the end. Bellings sat opposite Evelyn, pulled a thick folder of documents from his briefcase, and began methodically reviewing her case. He asked questions, made notes, sometimes shook his head when encountering particularly egregious procedural violations by the investigation. After 2 hours, he leaned back in his chair and said, "We have a strong position. Evidence of document forgery is convincing. Lieutenant Colonel Tucker's testimony is contradictory and can be challenged. Video recordings don't withstand expert scrutiny. Moreover, we have grounds to demand an investigation into Colonel Dawson's actions. He conducted the case with violations of procedural norms." Evelyn felt a glimmer appear inside. "So there's a chance?" she asked. Bellings nodded. "There is, but we need time, and we need to find who was helping Morrison. If we find him and make him talk, the case will collapse like a house of cards." Over the next 2 weeks, Zoe Hartman performed brilliant operational work. She reviewed hundreds of phone call records, analyzed financial flows connected to Morrison's relatives and acquaintances, and finally picked up the trail. It turned out that Captain Benjamin Arnold Schofield of the military police, who worked at the correctional facility at USP Florence where Morrison had escaped, had regular contact with the brother of one of Morrison's accomplices, Stephen Carraway. Moreover, Schofield's bank account had received several large transfers totaling $25,000 in the 3 months before the escape, the origin of which he couldn't explain. Zoe passed this information to the Military Police Internal Affairs Division, and Schofield was arrested. Under pressure from evidence and threat of lengthy imprisonment, Schofield broke and began talking. He confessed to helping Morrison organize the escape, to passing him information about the facility's security regime, to supplying him with lock-picking tools. Moreover, he revealed that Morrison had connections with an organized crime group in Denver that financed the information campaign against Evelyn and provided technical support for creating forged documents and videos. Schofield also named 3 other officers, Captain Leo Daniels and 2 lieutenants, Terrence Zorn and Victor Moses, who received bribes from criminal structures and helped Morrison remain free by passing him information about the progress of law enforcement operations. When Royce brought Evelyn this news, she felt everything inside turn over. Finally, concrete names appeared, concrete evidence of a conspiracy against her. This wasn't just persecution by criminal elements, it was an entire network of corruption, encompassing law enforcement and military structures. And now, she held all the cards. Royce continued, "Bellings has already filed a motion to reconsider your case based on new evidence. General Stephen Anthony Kowalski, commander of U.S. Army Forces Command, personally took control of the case. He doesn't tolerate corruption and wants to get to the bottom of it." Evelyn knew General Kowalski. He was an old-school man, tough, principled, tolerating neither lies nor betrayal. If he took on the case, it meant justice would be restored. But Evelyn wasn't going to just wait for the system to sort things out itself. She had her own plans. "When will I be released?" she asked Royce, looking him straight in the eyes. "I want you to help me finish this. Morrison and his men must be found. All those who helped them must pay. And I want to participate in this personally." Royce looked at her for a long time, then slowly nodded. "I understand, and I'll be with you to the end." On the 28th day of detention, the cell door opened and Colonel Sullivan entered, accompanied by 2 officers. His face was serious, but his eyes held something resembling respect. "Captain Cross," he said in an official tone, "based on new evidence presented by your attorney and by order of the commander of U.S. Army Forces Command, General Kowalski, all charges against you are dropped. You are fully exonerated and reinstated to duty with an official apology from the command. You are free." Evelyn slowly rose from the bunk. Her legs were weak after a month of detention, but energy boiled inside. She felt no joy or relief, only cold determination. Justice was beginning to be restored, but her work wasn't finished yet. She left the stockade cell into freedom, and the first thing she thought was, now the real hunt begins. Release from the stockade became for Evelyn Cross not the end of trials, but the beginning of a new phase of the fight to restore justice. When she walked into freedom on that overcast June day, Royce Lightwood and Zoe Hartman were there to meet her. Their faces expressed a mixture of relief and restrained joy. Royce hugged her firmly, like a brother, and Zoe handed her a clean uniform and bag with personal items. "Welcome back, Evie," she said quietly. But Evelyn knew simply returning to her former life would be impossible. A month in detention had changed her, hardened her, made her tougher and more determined. She was no longer the officer who believed in the system's infallibility and automatic justice. Now she understood that justice must be fought for with your own hands, not hoping someone else would do it for you. First, they drove to Attorney Prescott Belling's office, where an important meeting was to take place regarding further strategy. Bellings had already prepared all necessary documents for official review of Evelyn's case, but now they needed to go further, to demand not just dropping of charges, but complete exposure of the conspiracy organized against her, and punishment for all involved. In Belling's spacious office, lined with bookshelves of legal literature and decorated with diplomas and awards for won cases, gathered a small group of people who had become Evelyn's allies in her fight. Besides Royce and Zoe, there was also Colonel Vincent Irving Yellowbird from the Army's Internal Affairs Division, who was conducting the investigation into corrupt officers who helped Morrison. Yellowbird was a man in his early 50s with graying hair and the tired but penetrating gaze of someone who had seen too much dirt in the system he was supposed to protect. He spread folders with case materials on the table and began his briefing. Captain Benjamin Schofield, who first broke under pressure from evidence, gave comprehensive testimony about how Morrison's escape and his accomplices was organized. It turned out the riot at the facility was provoked deliberately. Several inmates from warring factions received money and promises of better conditions in exchange for staging a massive fight that would distract guards' attention. Schofield personally provided Morrison with tools, bolt cutters, and a crowbar, hidden in the workshop and passed to him through a bribed inmate. Moreover, Schofield arranged for video surveillance to be disabled in the fence section where the escape was planned, citing technical malfunctions. Outside the facility, Morrison and his men were met by a car with fake plates provided by Captain Leo Daniels, who worked in the Military Police Transportation Division. Yellowbird continued his briefing, and the picture became increasingly horrifying. After the escape, Morrison didn't just hide. He actively worked to destroy Evelyn's reputation, using connections with the organized crime group Rocky Mountain Syndicate that controlled significant criminal business in Colorado and had corrupted agents in law enforcement structures. The group's leader, a certain Trent Oscar Bingham, known in the criminal world by the nickname Bingo, had personal scores to settle with military structures because several years ago, military intelligence had dismantled his weapons smuggling operation across the Canadian border. Morrison offered Bingham a deal. If he helped organize the information campaign against Evelyn and provided financing and technical support, Morrison would hand over the classified military documents he'd stolen. Bingham agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to take revenge on the military and simultaneously obtain valuable information. It was Bingham's people who hired specialists in computer graphics and editing who created the forged videos and documents. They organized mass distribution of flyers and online publications. And they bribed Lieutenants Terrence Zorn and Victor Moses, who passed Morrison information about Evelyn's movements and the investigation's progress. When Yellowbird finished his report, heavy silence hung in the office. Evelyn sat clenching her fists so hard her knuckles turned white. The scale of the conspiracy against her exceeded anything she could have imagined. This wasn't just one criminal authority's revenge. It was an entire network of corruption and crime that had penetrated deep into law enforcement and military structures. Bellings broke the silence by tapping his pen on the table. "We have all the evidence. Schofield's testimony is backed by phone conversation records, financial documents, testimony from other witnesses. Daniels, Zorn, and Moses are already arrested and also began giving testimony, trying to mitigate their fate. We can demand not only full exoneration of Captain Cross, but also criminal prosecution of everyone involved, including Lieutenant Colonel Tucker, who gave false testimony." Evelyn raised her eyes and looked at the attorney. "And Colonel Dawson? He conducted the case with prejudice, ignored evidence of my innocence, pressured me psychologically. Shouldn't he bear punishment?" Yellowbird intervened. "Dawson acted within his authority, though with obvious bias. Proving malicious intent will be difficult, but we can demand an official investigation of his actions and possibly removal from his position." Evelyn nodded, understanding not all her enemies would receive equal punishment. But the main thing was, the truth would come out. 3 days after the meeting in Bellings' office, General Stephen Kowalski personally summoned Evelyn to his office at Forces Command Headquarters in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Kowalski was a legendary figure who had been through 2 Iraq tours and commanded several major operations. His authority in the Army was unquestionable. When Evelyn entered his office, the general stood from behind his desk and extended his hand. "Captain Cross," he said in a firm voice, "I've studied all materials of your case. What happened to you is a disgrace to our system. You were unjustly accused, humiliated, and placed under arrest based on fabricated evidence. On behalf of U.S. Army Forces Command, I offer you official apologies." He paused, then continued. "But apologies aren't enough. I've ordered a full investigation of all circumstances of this case. Document analysis confirmed their forgery. File metadata irrefutably proves they were edited after falling into criminals' hands. Video recordings supposedly depicting you were analyzed using the most modern methods, and experts established this is fabrication using artificial intelligence technology. All charges against you are completely dropped, your name is cleared, and you are reinstated to duty with all rights and privileges." Evelyn listened to the general's words and for the first time in long months felt something like relief. But the general wasn't finished. "Moreover," he continued, "we conducted an investigation into Lieutenant Colonel Tucker's actions. Analysis of his phone conversations and financial operations showed he indeed gave you verbal orders to transport documents to Fort Carson, but then, fearing possible responsibility for procedural violations, denied it. His testimony was false. Tucker is removed from his position and demoted to captain with transfer to another unit. As for Colonel Dawson, we found no evidence of his direct collusion with criminals, but his actions were deemed unprofessional and biased. He received a severe reprimand and will be transferred to another position." The general paused once more, then opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small box. "Captain Cross, for courage displayed in fighting organized crime, for steadfastness under conditions of undeserved persecution, and for faithfulness to military duty, I'm presenting you for award of the Soldier's Medal. The award ceremony will take place next week." Evelyn accepted the box with the medal, but inside felt no joy one might expect. An award couldn't compensate for all the humiliations and suffering she'd been through, but it was a sign the system acknowledged its mistake, and that was important. After the meeting with the general, Evelyn returned to Denver, where Royce and Zoe awaited her. News of Evelyn's exoneration and arrest of corrupt officers had already spread through military units, and the atmosphere around her changed dramatically. Officers who just a week ago avoided her gaze now approached and shook her hand, apologizing for not supporting her in the difficult moment. Some tried to justify themselves, saying they always believed in her innocence but simply couldn't openly express their support. Evelyn accepted these apologies with cold politeness, but inside she hadn't forgotten who stood with her in the darkest days and who betrayed her. Particularly telling was the reaction of Lieutenant Isaac Sheldon, who had publicly called her a traitor at formation. He came to her office, pale and trembling, and tried to apologize, explaining he'd been misled by false information and acted thoughtlessly. Evelyn heard him out silently, then said in an icy tone, "You didn't just insult me publicly. You questioned an officer's honor based on rumors without bothering to check facts. There's no place in the Army for such people. I recommend you submit resignation paperwork before it's done for you." Sheldon left the office broken and humiliated, and a week later, indeed, left the Army. But the main triumph was that information about the corruption network that helped Morrison became public knowledge. Bellings organized a press conference where he presented all evidence of the conspiracy against Evelyn. Journalists from regional and even national outlets attended the conference, and the story of Captain Cross, who was unjustly accused of treason and then fully exonerated, became a sensation. Newspapers wrote about corruption in law enforcement, about how criminals use forged documents to discredit honest officers, about the need for system reforms. Evelyn gave several interviews in which she calmly and with dignity told what she'd been through, not naming those who betrayed her, but clearly identifying the problem. The system should protect its officers, not become a tool for their destruction in criminals' hands. Her words were quoted by dozens of publications, and public opinion completely turned in her favor. Evelyn Cross became a symbol of fighting injustice and corruption, a heroine who didn't break under pressure and proved her innocence. But Evelyn herself didn't feel like a heroine. She felt like someone who survived a war but hadn't finished it yet. Morrison was still at large, and until he was caught, justice couldn't be considered fully restored. After full exoneration and reinstatement to duty, Evelyn Cross could have returned to regular service, tried to forget the nightmare of recent months, and continued her career. But she knew her mission wasn't yet complete. Tyler Morrison and 4 of his accomplices were still at large, hiding somewhere in the vastness of the American West. And every day of their freedom was like an unhealed wound for Evelyn. They had destroyed her life, disgraced her name, made her go through humiliation and suffering, and she couldn't rest knowing they were out there somewhere, possibly laughing at what they'd managed to do. Royce Lightwood understood her feelings better than anyone, and when they met a day after the official award ceremony where Evelyn received the Soldier's Medal, he said directly, "I know what you're thinking. You want to find them yourself." Evelyn nodded, not hiding her intentions. Police and the FBI have been looking for them for over 2 months and found nothing. Morrison knows too well how to hide. He has connections, money, safe houses. Conventional methods don't work. We need to act differently. Royce thought, then said, "I have connections in the intelligence services. I can organize an unofficial operation. But it'll be risky, Evie. If something goes wrong, we could be accused of exceeding authority." Evelyn looked him in the eyes with iron determination. "I'm ready to take the risk. These people must answer for everything they did." Royce used his connections in the FBI and military intelligence to gain access to classified operational information about the fugitives' whereabouts. Zoe Hartman connected all her Army counterintelligence resources, tracking financial flows and cell phones of people connected to Morrison. The work went slowly and painstakingly, requiring analysis of massive data arrays, monitoring hundreds of phone conversations, surveillance of dozens of suspicious individuals. But gradually, the picture began clearing. It emerged that after the escape, Morrison and his men hadn't stayed in Colorado, but moved east to Wyoming, where they hid in hard-to-reach areas, using support from local criminal authorities. One FBI informant embedded in Cheyenne's criminal circles reported that Morrison was living in a safe house in one of the city's residential neighborhoods, changing addresses every few days, but regularly meeting with a certain Ethan Faber, a local authority who provided him with fake documents and supplies. Zoe managed to establish that Faber owned several apartments in different Cheyenne neighborhoods used for hiding fugitive criminals. And one of these apartments was in a 9-story building on the city's outskirts in a neighborhood locals called Little Texas. The operation to capture Morrison and his accomplices was planned carefully. Royce assembled a group of 8 men, former Special Forces operators he trusted absolutely, and who were ready to act outside official frameworks. Among them were Timothy Pritchard, Slade Newton, Owen Turk, and others, the same men who helped Evelyn dismantle Morrison's gang the first time. Evelyn insisted on participating in the operation personally, and though Royce tried to dissuade her, understanding it could be dangerous, he finally relented, seeing her inflexibility. The group left for Cheyenne in 2 unmarked vans without identifying marks. The drive took 2 days, and the entire time Evelyn was focused and silent, mentally preparing for the upcoming encounter with the man who had become her personal demon. When they arrived in Cheyenne, it was already evening. The city was sinking into twilight, and streetlights were coming on. They parked several blocks from the Target building and began surveillance. The apartment where Morrison was supposedly hiding was on the 7th floor of the 9-story building. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and light burned constantly, indicating people's presence inside. Zoe, who remained in Denver for coordination, via secure communications confirmed that cell phones registered to shell persons connected to Morrison were active in this area. This meant the fugitives were really here. Royce decided to act at night, when there would be fewer witnesses and residents in the entrance. The group split up. 4 were to penetrate the apartment through the front door, 2 to block the back exit and fire escape, and 2 more to stay in vehicles for quick evacuation. Evelyn insisted on being in the assault group, and Royce, though reluctantly, agreed. At 2 a.m., when the city slept, the group silently entered the building. They didn't use the elevator to avoid making noise, climbing the stairs, moving like shadows. In front of the apartment door, Timothy pulled out a special lock-picking tool, but it turned out the door was locked from inside, with a chain and additional bolt. They had to use a cruder method. Slade kicked the door with such force, the lock gave way and the door flew open. Inside the apartment were all 5 fugitives: Morrison, Ryback, Caraway, Lowell, and Sitwell. They sat at a table playing cards and drinking whiskey, clearly not expecting an attack. When the door burst in, they jumped up, but it was too late. The operators stormed inside, and a short but brutal fight ensued. Ryback tried to pull a knife from his pocket, but Owen Turk struck him with a baton on the hand, and the knife fell to the floor. Caraway rushed to the window, trying to jump out, but Timothy grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the floor. Lowell and Sitwell tried to break through to the door, but Slade and another fighter blocked their path. Within a minute, all 5 were knocked to the floor, hands tied with zip ties and immobilized. Morrison, pinned to the floor by 2 operators, raised his head and saw Evelyn standing in the doorway. His face twisted with horror and hatred. "You," he wheezed, "you found us." Evelyn slowly approached him, squatted down, and looked straight into his eyes. "I promised you'd pay for everything, and that moment has come." The fugitives weren't immediately handed over to authorities. First, they were taken to an abandoned warehouse on Cheyenne's outskirts, where Royce and his men conducted an educational conversation with them. What happened in that warehouse never became part of official reports. But when hours later Morrison and his accomplices were delivered to the local FBI field office, they were beaten, scared half to death, and completely broken. Morrison was no longer the arrogant, self-confident criminal he'd been before. He'd transformed into a pathetic, trembling man who begged for mercy and promised to tell everything he knew. And he really did tell. Under pressure, he gave up names of all his accomplices, everyone who helped him on the outside, including crime boss Trent Bingham and his people. He told how the information campaign against Evelyn was organized, who financed creation of forged documents, who spread lies online and in media. His testimony became key to destroying the entire criminal network behind the conspiracy. Over the next 2 weeks, the FBI and Army counterintelligence conducted a massive operation, resulting in arrest of 23 people, including Bingham, several corrupt police officers, and officials. But the main thing wasn't just detaining criminals. By personal order of General Stephen Kowalski, and with assistance from the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Morrison and 4 of his accomplices weren't sent to a regular penitentiary, where they might eventually establish connections, bribe guards, and possibly organize another escape or continue criminal activity from inside. Instead, they were sent to the secret Supermax facility, ADX Florence, in Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a place known only to a narrow circle in intelligence services. The most dangerous criminals, terrorists, traitors ended up there, those the government wanted isolated from society forever. Conditions at ADX Florence were harsh to the extreme. Complete isolation, 23-hour lockdown in individual cells, minimal contact with the outside world, no windows, constant video surveillance. Prisoners lived in concrete cells without heating, ate meager rations, and average life expectancy rarely exceeded the length of their sentences due to psychological breakdown. When Morrison learned where he was being sent, he lost consciousness right in his cell. His dream of freedom and revenge had turned into slow, agonizing death in one of America's most terrifying places. As for the corrupt officers, Captain Leo Daniels, Lieutenants Terrence Zorn and Victor Moses, and Captain Benjamin Schofield, they faced different punishment. They were tried by court-martial and sentenced to lengthy prison terms in regular federal penitentiaries. But before this, something strange happened to them. One night, a week before beginning to serve their sentences, unknown persons came to their families' homes in Colorado Springs, Denver, and Florence. They broke down doors, tied up residents, and methodically removed from homes everything of any value: money, jewelry, electronics, even furniture and clothes. Safes were professionally cracked, documents seized, bank cards and access codes obtained under threat of violence. By morning, homes were completely looted and families left with nothing. Police conducted an investigation, but never found the perpetrators. The criminals acted professionally, leaving no traces. When Evelyn learned of these robberies, she merely smiled coldly. She didn't know exactly who did it, but suspected Royce organized this operation as the final act of retribution. The corrupt officers not only lost their freedom and careers, but left their families in poverty, which was fair punishment for betraying their oath for money. Justice had prevailed. Morrison and his gang were sent where there was no return. Corrupt officers sat in prisons, their careers destroyed, families impoverished. The criminal network behind the conspiracy was dismantled. Evelyn Cross's name was fully cleared, and she became a symbol of fighting injustice. But Evelyn herself felt no triumph. She felt only fatigue and emptiness. Revenge was accomplished, but it hadn't brought the relief Evelyn hoped for. The scars remained, and they would never heal. After justice was finally restored, Morrison and his accomplices sent to the country's harshest prison, corrupt officers receiving deserved punishment, Evelyn Cross faced an unexpected realization. Her career in the U.S. Army was effectively over. Formally, she was fully exonerated, reinstated to duty, awarded a medal, and even recommended for promotion to major. But reality proved more complex than official documents could show. Despite public acknowledgement of her innocence and heroism, the atmosphere around her had changed irreversibly. Too many people had seen her in handcuffs. Too many officers had read those forged accusations and even momentarily believed them. Even those who now apologized and shook her hand retained deep down some shadow of doubt, some awkward feeling when dealing with her. Evelyn understood she'd become an inconvenient figure for the system, too scandalous, too well-known, too much a reminder of how deep corruption and crime could penetrate military structures. Her presence was a constant reproach to those who hadn't supported her, and a reminder of the system's shortcomings to those at the top. Moreover, Evelyn herself felt something inside her had broken forever. That naive faith in the system's justice, that sense of pride in service she'd felt before, all of it had disappeared, leaving only bitterness and disappointment. The decision to leave the Army didn't come immediately. Evelyn spent another 3 months on duty, trying to return to normal work, performing her duties as a military intelligence captain, participating in briefings and operations. But each day she felt increasing alienation. She saw the faces of those who'd betrayed her, who'd turned away in her hardest moment, and couldn't forgive them even if they asked forgiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Tucker was demoted and transferred to another unit, but she knew there were many like him in the system, people ready to lie and betray a comrade to save their own career. Colonel Dawson received a reprimand but continued working at Army CID, and Evelyn occasionally saw him in corridors, and each encounter was like a knife thrust. Lieutenant Sheldon, who publicly called her a traitor, left the Army, but the damage he'd inflicted on her reputation remained. Royce Lightwood and Zoe Hartman remained her loyal friends, but even they noticed how she was changing, how gradually the fire that once burned in her eyes was fading. Royce tried several times to talk to her about the future, suggesting she take extended leave, go somewhere to rest, try to recover psychologically. But Evelyn just shook her head, saying everything was fine, though both knew it wasn't. The breaking point came at the end of September when Evelyn was summoned to Washington, D.C. for a meeting at Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters. Formally, this concerned discussion of new methods for countering organized crime in Western regions, and her presence was due to her recent experience fighting criminal structures. But when she arrived in Washington and entered the DIA building in Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, she felt this was something more than a routine meeting. She was met by Lieutenant General Victor Paul Rollins, Deputy Director of DIA, a man with enormous authority and influence. He invited her to his office, offered coffee, and began the conversation indirectly, asking about her service, how she was coping after all the trials. Then he got to the point. "Captain Cross, I've carefully studied your case and everything that happened to you. How you handled this situation commands respect. You showed yourself as the highest class officer, steadfast, principled, unbroken even by the most difficult circumstances. We have few such people in our system." He paused, then continued. "But I also see you're tired. I see it in your eyes. You've been through hell, and no one can demand you continue serving as if nothing happened." General Rollins leaned back in his chair and looked at Evelyn with understanding. "I have a proposal for you. We can transfer you to another unit, possibly here in D.C., where you'll start with a clean slate without the burden of the past. Or, if you feel you need a break, we can arrange extended medical leave with retention of rank and all benefits. But there's also a third option." He paused, giving Evelyn time to absorb his words. "You can leave the Army, not in disgrace, not in dishonor, but with full honors, with recognition of your service and recommendations that will open any door in civilian life. I won't hide it. Sometimes leaving is the wisest decision. Not all wounds heal, and it's not always worth forcing yourself to stay where it hurts." Evelyn listened to his words, and for the first time in long months, felt someone truly understood her condition, wasn't trying to convince her to be strong, wasn't demanding the impossible. She thought about her life, 20 years of service, numerous operations, awards, achievements, but also about betrayal, humiliation, solitude in the cold stockade cell, the gazes of those who considered her a traitor. And she understood she no longer wanted to be part of this system. "I want to leave," she said quietly but firmly. General Rollins nodded with understanding. "Then I'll prepare all the documents. You'll leave with honor, as a hero who gave the nation everything she could." A month later, Evelyn Cross officially ended her military career. The discharge ceremony took place in a small circle, without excess pomp, exactly as she wanted. General Kowalski personally handed her a certificate of appreciation and shook her hand, his words sincere. "You will always be an example of what it means to be a true officer. Thank you for your service." Royce and Zoe attended the ceremony, and when it ended, the three sat in a small cafe in downtown Denver, silently sipping coffee. Finally, Royce asked, What will you do next?" Evelyn looked out the window at the snow-covered city streets that had been her home for so many years and answered, "I'm leaving. There are too many memories here, too much pain. I need to start over, somewhere where nobody knows me." Zoe placed her hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Where will you go?" Evelyn smiled for the first time in a long while. "To Finland. I have a distant relative in Lappeenranta. She's invited me to visit for a long time. It's quiet there, peaceful, beautiful. Maybe there I can finally breathe." 2 months later, on a cold December day, Evelyn Cross crossed the U.S.-Finnish border on a flight to Helsinki, carrying only 2 suitcases of belongings and a bag of documents. Everything else, her Denver apartment, personal items, memories, she left behind. The journey to Lappeenranta took several hours, and when she arrived in this small Finnish town located on the shore of Lake Saimaa, she felt something strange: peace. The town was quiet, clean, orderly, with low houses surrounded by pine trees, snow-covered streets where cars drove unhurriedly. There was no rush, no aggression, none of that constant tension she'd felt in America. She was met by Anneli, a distant cousin of her grandmother, an elderly Finnish woman in her 70s who lived alone in a small wooden house on the town's outskirts. Anneli spoke almost no English, and Evelyn knew only basic Finnish, but they managed to understand each other. Anneli offered Evelyn to stay with her until she found her own housing, and Evelyn gratefully accepted. The first weeks in Finland were a period of adaptation for Evelyn. She rented a small lakeside house several kilometers from downtown Lappeenranta, a wooden structure with 2 rooms, a porch, and a view of the frozen lake surrounded by forest. The house was modest but cozy, with a stove that warmed the space on cold nights, large windows through which soft northern light penetrated. Evelyn furnished it minimally: several pieces of furniture, a bookshelf, a desk by the window where she could sit and look at the lake. She began learning Finnish, attending evening courses at the local cultural center, and gradually gaining the ability to communicate with locals. Finns were reserved people who didn't ask unnecessary questions and respected personal space, and this was exactly what Evelyn needed. She got a job as a consultant at the private security company Securitas Finland, which specialized in providing security for commercial facilities. Her military experience and intelligence knowledge proved very much in demand, and company management gladly hired her without asking too many questions about her past. The work was calm, didn't require constant stress and life-threatening risk, and Evelyn, for the first time in many years, felt she could simply live rather than survive. In the evenings, Evelyn sat on her house's porch, wrapped in a warm blanket, with a cup of hot tea in her hands, watching the sunset over Lake Saimaa. The sky was painted in shades of pink, orange, and purple, reflecting in the smooth water surface, and in the distance beyond the forest, the sun set, leaving only soft twilight. The silence here was complete. No shouting, gunshots, sounds of military equipment, only the rustle of wind in pines and occasional birdsong. Sometimes Royce and Zoe sent her encrypted messages via secure channels, telling what was happening in America, how the situation was developing with those punished for the conspiracy against her. Royce wrote that Morrison hadn't survived even a year at ADX Florence. Harsh conditions, heavy psychological pressure, and lack of adequate medical care had killed him. His remaining accomplices were also slowly dying there, in cold and isolation. The corrupt officers were serving sentences in regular federal penitentiaries, but their lives there were unbearable. The reputation of traitors made them outcasts even among inmates. Justice truly had prevailed. But Evelyn felt no joy from this news. She simply acknowledged the facts and continued living. Gradually, wounds began healing. Evelyn made several acquaintances in Lappeenranta. Neighbor Kaisa, a retired teacher, sometimes invited her for tea. Work colleague Juhani, a former police officer, shared stories from his career. Local priest Father Marcus suggested she attend a support group for people who'd experienced trauma. Evelyn hesitated for a long time, but finally began attending the group's meetings. And there, among other people who'd survived wars, violence, injustice, she first in a long time felt she wasn't alone. She began telling her story, Not all of it, of course, omitting classified details, but enough to speak out, to release the pain she'd held inside so long. And it helped. She slept better. Nightmares became less frequent. And one morning, waking and seeing dawn over the lake outside her window, she realized that for the first time in a year, she felt something like happiness. Not wild joy, not euphoria, but simply a quiet, calm sense that life continues, that she survived, that she proved her innocence and took revenge on all who tried to break her. Now she was free. Free from the past, from the army, from hatred and thirst for revenge. Evelyn Cross had begun a new life in Finland, and this life was her own, controlled by no one, built on her terms. And that was all she wanted.